Imagine a limestone cave in the Ache Valley of southern Germany, roughly 35,000 years ago, during the peak of a brutal, soul-chilling midwinter. Outside, the wind is screaming across a landscape of permafrost, but inside, a small group of people is huddled around a fire that has been burning for 3 days straight. There is plenty of smoked reindeer meat left in the corner, the skins are thick and warm, and the immediate threat of a cave lion is non-existent. In this specific moment, there is a man sitting on a flat stone, turning a hollowed-out wing bone of a griffin vulture over and over in his hands. He isn't sharpening it into a needle or a spear point, which would be the logical thing to do if survival were his only goal. Instead, he is staring at the ceiling, waiting for the hours to pass, feeling a strange, itchy restlessness in his chest that he can't quite name. You have probably been told that this man didn't exist, or at least that he didn't have the time to feel that way. There is a massive, incredibly persistent myth that ancient humans were essentially biological machines, 100% dedicated to the grind of staying alive. We like to imagine them as being in a state of constant panicked movement, either hunting, gathering, or running away from something with very large teeth. We assume that boredom is a luxury of the modern world, a side effect of having smartphones and high-speed internet and grocery stores that sell pre-washed lettuce. We think of our ancestors as being too busy to be bored, but as it turns out, and I mean this in the most literal scientific sense, that narrative is almost entirely backwards. Everything you've been told about the relentless struggle of prehistoric life is a misunderstanding of what it actually means to be a human being. The first big myth we need to dismantle is the idea that ancient life was a 24-hour-a-day job. We have this mental image of the primitive person struggling from dawn until dusk just to find enough calories to keep their heart beating, but the data says otherwise. In 1966, an anthropologist named Richard Lee conducted a landmark study of the Kungsan people in the Kalahari Desert, who at the time lived a lifestyle very similar to our prehistoric ancestors. What he found sent shockwaves through the academic world, and frankly, it should make most modern office workers want to quit their jobs immediately. The adults in this community only needed to work about 12 to 19 hours a week to provide everything they needed. When you add in the time spent on domestic chores, they still had more leisure time than almost any person living in an industrial society today. Anthropologist Marshall Solins later took this data and famously labeled these groups the original affluent society. The logic is simple. They didn't have a lot, but they didn't want a lot, so their needs were met incredibly quickly. This means that for tens of thousands of years, our ancestors weren't spending their evenings frantically sharpening spears in a state of exhaustion. They were sitting around, they were waiting for the sun to come up. They were, by every modern definition of the word, bored out of their minds. Boredom isn't a bug in the human operating system that appeared in the 21st century. It is a fundamental feature that was forged in the silence of those caves. Now, if you're sitting in a cave for 14 hours of darkness with nothing to do, your brain, which is a 3-pound supercomputer designed for complex problem solving, starts to get desperate for input. This leads us to the second myth, the idea that ancient art and music were purely sacred or ritualistic. Whenever archaeologists find something they can't explain, they tend to label it as a religious artifact, but that ignores the much more likely reality of human nature. Consider that vulture bone flute from the Ache Valley I mentioned earlier. Research by musicologists like Friedrich Seeberger has shown that these flutes weren't just random noisemakers. They were precisely tuned instruments capable of complex melodies. It takes a staggering amount of time to carve a bone flute, especially when your only tools are made of flint. You have to hollow it out, calculate the spacing of the finger holes, and shave down the mouthpiece until it produces a clear note. You don't do that because you're trying to survive a winter. You do it because the silence of the cave is becoming unbearable. Music was the first content. It was a way to fill the empty air and give the brain a pattern to follow when there was no external stimulation. As a quick aside, the oldest flute ever found is about 60,000 years old, meaning we were making playlists long before we were making permanent houses. Music was the prehistoric version of putting on a podcast to drown out the quiet. This brings us to a third, even more common misconception, that ancient people were simple-minded and therefore easily satisfied by basic tasks. We assume that because they didn't have complex technology, they didn't have complex psychological needs. But the evolutionary reality is that our brains haven't changed in any significant way for at least 200,000 years. A person living in the Upper Paleolithic had the exact same capacity for existential dread, curiosity, and agitation as you do. When they ran out of things to talk about, which happens quickly when you live in a group of only 30 people, they didn't just sit there in a zen-like state of peace. They looked for ways to game their environment. This is where the history of games gets fascinatingly weird. Most people think of board games as a product of early civilizations like Egypt or Mesopotamia, but the roots of gaming go much deeper. We find randomizing devices like carved knuckle bones, astragalus, in sites that date back long before the first city was ever built. In the cave of the Sibyl in Italy, archaeologists found hundreds of these small bones that had been worn smooth by human hands. While some were used for divination, many others show the telltale signs of being used for gambling or simple games of chance. Think about the psychological state required to invent a game. You have to be so bored with reality that you decide to create a fake reality with arbitrary rules just to see what happens. Interestingly enough, this is the same impulse that drives modern video game design. One of the oldest known board games, Senet, was found in Egyptian tombs dating back to 3100 BCE. But the game was already so polished and balanced that it clearly had a much older beta testing phase in the nomadic camps of the desert. These weren't just toys, they were mental life rafts. They provided a way to experience risk, reward, and social competition without anyone having to actually die. But what if you didn't have a game board or a flute? What if you were just stuck in the middle of a long migration with nothing but the dirt beneath your feet? This leads us to the fourth myth, the idea that ancient humans only created things that were useful. We've all seen the beautiful sweeping paintings of bison and horses on the walls of Lascaux or Altamira, and we're told they were hunting magic meant to bring luck to the tribe. While that might be part of it, it doesn't explain the thousands of doodles archaeologists find in the margins. In caves across the world, there are finger flutings, lines drawn by human fingers into soft clay walls that have no discernible pattern or purpose. In Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers found a piece of ochre from 73,000 years ago with a simple cross-hatched pattern scratched into it. It's the oldest known drawing in human history, and it looks exactly like the kind of thing you'd scribble on a notepad while you're stuck on a long phone call. These were people with a massive stimulation gap. Their environment was providing them with a 2 out of 10 in terms of excitement, but their brains were wired for a 10 out of 10. To bridge that gap, they didn't just paint sacred images. They played with their surroundings. They decorated their spear throwers with intricate carvings that didn't make them fly any further. They spent hundreds of hours polishing beads made from ostrich eggshells just to make them shine. They were killing time in the most literal sense. The fifth myth is perhaps the most damaging to our understanding of ourselves, the idea that boredom is a bad thing that we should try to eliminate. In the modern world, we see boredom as a failure of our entertainment systems, but in the ancient world, boredom was the primary engine of innovation. Evolutionary psychologists often talk about the search for stimulation as a survival mechanism. If a human is perfectly content sitting still, they will never look over the next hill. They will never experiment with a new type of flint knapping. They will never wonder what happens if you soak a specific root in water for 3 days. Boredom is an alarm system. It's your brain telling you that you are currently wasting a high-powered cognitive resource on a low-value task. For an ancient human, that itch of boredom was what pushed them to create. As a side note, it's worth wondering if we would have ever left Africa if our ancestors had been just a little bit more easily entertained. We didn't invent clothing just because we were cold. We invented fashion, the specific, intricate patterns of weaving and dyeing, because we were bored with just being warm. We didn't just invent language to say there is a lion. We invented storytelling because saying there is a lion takes 3 seconds, and we still had 5 hours of firelight left to fill. This brings us to the most powerful tool ancient humans had for dealing with boredom, the narrative. We often hear that stories were the oral history of the tribe, which sounds very dignified and academic. But in reality, stories were the Netflix of the Stone Age. When you look at the structure of ancient myths, they are designed with the same retention loops we use in modern media. They have cliffhangers, they have relatable heroes, and they have shocking plot twists. Robin Dunbar, a famous evolutionary psychologist, proposed the social brain hypothesis, which suggests that our huge brains evolved primarily to handle the complexities of social interaction. He argues that language evolved as a form of vocal grooming. Just as monkeys pick lice off each other to bond, humans started gossiping to maintain social ties. But gossip has a limit. You can only talk about who stole whose dried berries for so long. Eventually, you have to start making things up. You start telling stories about the spirit of the north wind or the great bear in the sky. These stories didn't just preserve history. They were a collective hallucinatory experience that kept 30 people from murdering each other out of sheer irritability during a 3-week rainstorm. There is a unifying truth here that most history books completely miss. Boredom wasn't an accidental side effect of human evolution, it was the catalyst. Every single thing we define as civilization, art, music, complex language, games, philosophy, is effectively just a highly advanced way of dealing with the fact that humans hate being bored. We are the only species on Earth that will intentionally put ourselves in danger or spend thousands of hours on a useless task, just to avoid the discomfort of an understimulated brain. When you look at the Venus figurines of the Gravettian culture, those tiny, incredibly detailed statues of women carved from mammoth ivory 25,000 years ago, you are looking at the product of boredom. It takes about 100 to 200 hours of meticulous scraping to make one of those figurines. In a world with no electricity and no metal, that is a massive investment of mental energy. A person didn't carve that because they were hungry. They carved it because they were sitting in a tent made of mammoth bones while a blizzard raged outside, and if they didn't find a way to occupy their hands and their mind, they were going to lose their sanity. This same drive explains the mystery of Göbekli Tepe, the 12,000-year-old temple complex in Turkey. For decades, archaeologists wondered why nomadic hunter-gatherers would suddenly stop and spend years hauling multi-ton stone pillars into circles. They weren't farmers yet. They didn't have spare labor in the way we think of it, but if you view Göbekli Tepe as a massive communal boredom buster, it makes perfect sense. It was a project. It was a reason to gather, a reason to feast, and a reason to talk. It was a way to turn a quiet, empty landscape into something loud and complicated and interesting. The chilling part of this realization is that we haven't actually solved the problem our ancestors were facing. We've just outsourced it. When that man in the Ak Valley sat with his vulture bone flute, he was the creator of his own stimulation. He had to reach into the void of his own mind and pull out a melody that didn't exist yet. He had to be an artist, a musician, and a storyteller just to get through the night. Today, we have replaced that internal creative drive with an endless stream of external inputs. We don't have to be bored anymore because we have 1,000 people in our pockets whose entire job is to keep us from ever having to sit in silence. But honestly, I'm not sure if that's an upgrade. We like to think of our ancestors as being trapped in a world of physical hardship, but in many ways, they were more cognitively free than we are. Their boredom was a blank canvas. Ours is a crowded screen. They dealt with the quiet hours by expanding their internal worlds, creating myths that would last for 10,000 years and songs that still resonate in our DNA. They took the terrifying silence of the prehistoric night and filled it with the sound of bone flutes and the flicker of shadow puppets on cave walls. They weren't just surviving, they were building the foundations of the human experience out of the raw material of their own restlessness. So, the next time you find yourself reaching for your phone the second you have 30 seconds of downtime, remember that vulture bone in the cave. Remember that the itch you're feeling is the same itch that led to the invention of the wheel, the painting of the Sistine Chapel, and the exploration of the stars. Boredom isn't something to be cured. It's a demand from your brain to do something meaningful with your time. Our ancestors didn't have apps, but they had an infinite capacity for wonder. They didn't just deal with boredom, they used it to invent the world. Think about that for a second. Seriously, just sit with it. Every piece of technology you use, every song you love, and every story that has ever moved you is just a sophisticated version of a prehistoric man scratching a line in the dirt because he had nothing else to do. We are the children of the bored. We are the descendants of people who looked at a dark cave and decided that nothing wasn't an acceptable answer. They took the silence and they broke it, not because they had to, but because they couldn't stand the quiet. The real question isn't how they survived without our distractions. The real question is whether we could survive a single night in their world without ours. Could you sit by that fire for 14 hours with nothing but your own thoughts and a hollow bone? Could you find a way to make the darkness feel like a home instead of a prison? Our ancestors did it every single night for thousands of generations. They didn't just deal with the boredom, they mastered it. And in that mastery, they became the people who would eventually build everything we see around us today. It's easy to look back at them with a sense of pity, imagining them shivering in the dark, wishing they had a book or a movie, but that is just our own modern bias speaking. If anything, they might pity us for how easily we are distracted. They had something we've largely lost, the ability to exist in the stimulation gap without panicking. They knew that the best stories come from the quietest rooms, and the most beautiful music comes from the most empty bones. They didn't need a constant stream of information to feel alive. They just needed a fire, a group of friends, and the courage to look into the darkness and see something other than an empty space. When we look at the archaeological record, we see the tools of survival, the spear points, the scrapers, the fire pits. But we also see the tools of the mind. We see the flutes, the beads, the figurines, and the painted walls. These are the fossils of boredom. They are the proof that even in the harshest conditions imaginable, the human spirit refuses to be idle. We are a species that requires meaning, and if we can't find it in the world around us, we will carve it out of a piece of ivory or paint it onto a rock. This brings us back to that midwinter night in southern Germany 35,000 years ago. The fire is dying down now, and the rest of the tribe is asleep, wrapped in heavy furs. The man with the vulture bone flute finally stops playing. He sets the instrument down on the cold stone floor, right next to a small, discarded pile of charcoal from the fire. He leans back against the cave wall, looking at the handprint he blew onto the stone months earlier using red ochre. In the flickering light, the handprint seems to move, as if it's waving to him from the past. He isn't thinking about the reindeer he needs to hunt tomorrow, or the hole in his moccasin that needs fixing. He's just sitting there, breathing in the cold air, feeling the weight of the silence. He is bored, yes, but he is also entirely present. He has spent the last 4 hours creating something beautiful out of nothing, and in doing so, he has reminded himself that he is more than just a belly that needs to be filled. He is a creator, he is a thinker, he is a human being, and as he closes his eyes to sleep, he knows that the morning will come, and with it, the work of survival will begin again. But for now, in the quiet, he has won. He has filled the void. Now, I want you to do something, and please actually try this. Put down your device. Turn off the screen. Sit in a chair in a quiet room for just 10 minutes. Don't read, don't listen to music, and don't check your notifications. Just sit there. Within 2 minutes, you will feel that itch. Your brain will start to scream for something to do. You will feel a restless energy in your chest, and your mind will start racing through a million different thoughts. That feeling, that exact, uncomfortable, irritating sensation is the most ancient part of your heritage. That is the ghost of the Ak Valley calling out to you. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to drown it out with another 30 minutes of mindless scrolling, or are you going to see where it leads you? Are you going to use that boredom to create something, or are you just going to let it be a source of stress? Our ancestors chose to create. They chose to turn their boredom into a flute, a painting, or a story that would outlive their civilization. They understood that the itch of boredom is actually an invitation to be more than just a consumer. If this look into the silent hours of prehistory changed the way you think about your own downtime, maybe consider sticking around for more of these deep dives into the weird corners of our past. There are a lot of myths left to bust, and the truth is usually much more interesting than the stories we've been told. Let me know in the comments, what's the most useless thing you've ever spent hours doing just because you were bored? I genuinely love to know, because at the end of the day, those useless things are usually the parts of us that are the most human. We began this journey by looking at a man in a cave, staring at a vulture bone during a frozen February night 35,000 years ago. We saw him as a figure of struggle, a person whose life was defined by the harshness of his environment. But now, hopefully, you see him differently. You see that bone not as a tool for his hands, but as an escape hatch for his mind. That flute wasn't a luxury, it was a weapon. It was the way he fought back against the crushing weight of the silence and the dark. It was how he proved to himself that he wasn't just another animal waiting for the winter to end. The chilling reality is that the vulture bone is still there. It's sitting in a museum case now, cold and silent and thousands of years old. But the impulse that created it, the desperate, itchy, beautiful need to fill the void, is sitting right there inside you. Every time you feel bored, you are standing on the edge of that same limestone cliff. You are staring into the same darkness. And the only thing that has changed in 35,000 years is how easy it has become for us to ignore the call. The silence of the cave hasn't gone away. We've just gotten better at pretending we can't hear it. But if you ever truly want to know who you are, you have to put down the bone, turn off the light, and listen to what the quiet has to say. Because in the end, we didn't just deal with boredom to survive. We survived so that we could finally have the time to be bored. That is the definitive, heavy truth of our species. We are the architects of our own distraction, forever running away from the very silence that made us who we are.